Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a place where winter never truly leaves, where the sky sits so low and grey you feel you could touch it with an outstretched hand? Imagine existing in a landscape so vast and white that memory becomes your only map, where survival depends not on what you own, but on what you remember. The way your grandfather read the clouds, the pattern your grandmother stitched into leather to mark the seasons, the old songs that contained instructions for finding water beneath ice. Across the frozen Siberian steppe, families followed quiet paths traced by reindeer hooves, their entire world compressed into the rhythm of migration, the crackle of small fires, and the endless negotiation with cold. These were not people living in harmony with nature. That phrase is far too gentle. They were people locked in a slow, patient struggle with an environment that offered little mercy and no second chances. Tonight, we step into that white silence together. Before we begin this quiet journey into the endless winter of Siberian nomads, I'd like to ask something small of you. If you're willing, tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History so you can drift with us through more of these late-night passages into forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is in your part of the world. Some of you might be listening in the deep stillness of night, others just beginning your day, others somewhere in that quiet in-between. Now perhaps dim your lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for that soft, steady hum in the background, and let yourself settle in. We're about to step into a world where cold wasn't just a sensation. It was a presence, a companion, a constant voice, whispering through every decision, every movement, every breath. You wake in darkness, but you've learned not to call it morning yet. The word morning suggests warmth arriving, light spreading, the world opening like a flower. But here, on the frozen steppe, dawn is only a slight thinning of the dark, a pale grey bleeding reluctantly across the horizon. Your eyes open inside the chum, the conical tent made of reindeer hide, layered thick enough to block the wind, but never thick enough to block the cold. The cold finds its way in through every seam, every gap, settling in layers, heaviest near the ground, lighter near the smoke hole at the top, but never truly absent anywhere. You lie still for a moment, postponing movement. Beneath the reindeer furs piled over you, your body has created a small pocket of almost warmth, and to move is to lose it, to invite the air against your skin like the touch of metal. But you must move because the reindeer must be checked. They are never far from your mind. Even in sleep, some part of you listens for the sound of them shifting, the soft scrape of hooves against hard snow, the low grunts that signal unease. You push the furs aside, and the cold wraps around you immediately. Not like water, but like something denser, something with weight. The air inside the chum smells of smoke and damp fur, and the sour, sweet scent of bodies pressed close through the night. Your spouse, your children, your aging mother, all of you breathing the same recycled air, all of you generating barely enough heat to keep the space from becoming a tomb. The fire in the center has burned down to embers. You kneel beside it, feeling the hardness of frozen ground through your knees, even through the layered hides you sleep on. You add small pieces of wood, precious, carefully gathered, and coax the flames back to life. Fire is not abundant here. Trees grow sparse and stunted, and every branch you burn is a branch you had to find, carry, preserve. The light grows, and you can see the others beginning to stir. No one speaks yet. Morning is a slow negotiation between sleep and waking, between the body's demand for rest and the day's demand for labor. You dress in layers. This is not a simple act of pulling on clothes, but a careful ritual of insulation. First, the inner layer, soft reindeer skin with the fur turned inward, touching your body, creating the first barrier against heat loss. Then the middle layer, another skin, this one with fur, turned outward, trapping air between the two layers. Air, you've learned, is the real insulator, not the hide itself, but the space between. Finally, the outer layer, thicker, tougher hide, treated with fat to repel moisture, because even in this frozen world, moisture is a threat. Sweat from exertion, condensation from breath, snow that melts against body heat and then refreezes, all of these can turn clothing from protection into danger. Your boots are perhaps the most important item you wear. Made from reindeer leg hide, the fur dense and naturally water-resistant, stuffed with dried grass that you change every few days to prevent moisture buildup. Frostbite comes quietest to the feet. You've seen men lose toes, seen the black creep of frozen flesh, seen the way a person's walk changes when they can no longer trust the ground beneath them. You step outside and the cold is a wall. There's no other way to describe it. Not a breeze, not a chill, but a solid thing you walk into that presses against your face, that makes your eyes water immediately, tears freezing in your lashes. The sky is the color of dirty wool. The sun, when it rises, if you can call it rising, will barely clear the horizon, will trace a low arc that gives light but little warmth, and will set again after only a few hours. The landscape stretches in every direction without feature, without landmark. Snow covers everything, smooths everything, makes the world into a blank page where only the smallest details matter. The way wind patterns the surface, the subtle depression that marks where a stream runs beneath ice, the distant dark line that might be forest or might be shadow. The reindeer are where you left them, which is both a relief and never a certainty. They stand in a loose cluster, their breath rising in clouds, their bodies dusted with snow. You count them, not with numbers exactly, but with a kind of visual inventory, a sense of completeness or incompleteness that comes from knowing them individually. This one with the notched ear, that one with the limp, the small female who is always last to move. They are not quite domestic, not quite wild. They tolerate your presence because you move with them, because you've learned their rhythm, because you know when to push and when to follow. You check their hooves, looking for ice build-up, looking for cracks in the hard keratin. A lame reindeer is a problem that ripples through everything. It slows the herd, requires extra attention, might mean you have to slaughter it earlier than planned, disrupting your carefully calculated resources. The herd must move today. This is not a decision you've made, it's a fact that lives in your body in the way you read the signs. The lichen here has been grazed thin. The reindeer have poured through snow to reach it, scraping down to the frozen ground, but there's not enough left to sustain them for more than another day. You must take them north, toward the forest edge, where lichen grows thicker in the shelter of stunted trees. It's a half-day's walk, perhaps more if the snow is deep or if wind slows you. Back inside the chum, your family is preparing to dismantle everything. This is work you've done 1,000 times, work that has the quality of ritual, not sacred exactly, but precise, necessary, unable to be rushed. The poles must be untied, the hide coverings rolled, the belongings packed onto sleds. Every item has its place, its order of packing, its relationship to every other item. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be wasted. The bone needle, the sinew thread, the small knife with a handle worn smooth by your grandmother's hand and now yours, these are not possessions but extensions of your ability to survive. Your children work without complaint. They've learned, they're learning still, that complaint achieves nothing, that the cold doesn't care about your feelings, that the work must be done whether you're tired or not, whether your fingers ache or not, whether you woke with the weight of sadness pressing on your chest or not. Your oldest child, maybe 10 winters old, struggles with a knot in the rope that binds the sled. You watch for a moment, resist the urge to step in immediately. It happens through struggle. If you solve every problem for them, they'll never develop the patience, the finger strength, the quiet determination that keeps a person alive out here. Finally, you kneel beside them, show them the trick, not pulling harder, but loosening first, finding the logic of the knot. They nod, understanding, and you see in their face the same expression you must have worn at that age, the same careful absorption of knowledge that might matter desperately someday. The camp comes down. Where there was structure, now there is only snow again, marked by the dark circle of the fire pit, the compressed areas where people slept, small signs that will disappear with the next snowfall. You don't look back. There's nothing to see, no home left behind, no place that holds memory or significance beyond the practical fact that you were there, and now you're not. The sleds are loaded, lashed to the gentlest reindeer, the ones who've learned to pull, who accept the harness without panic. The rest of the herd moves ahead, and you follow, your family a small dark line against endless white. Walking is the rhythm of your life. Not fast, never fast. Fast means sweat, means moisture. Building in clothing means energy burned too quickly. You walk at the pace of the reindeer, at the pace of the oldest person, at the pace that can be sustained for hours. Your breath comes steady, clouding in front of your face, and you watch that cloud, the way it disperses, because even breath reveals information, wind direction, air temperature, the subtle shifts that precede weather changes. The silence is not quite silent. There's the crunch of snow under boots, under hooves, the creak of sled runners, the occasional low sound from a reindeer, the rustle of wind against your outer layer of fur. But beneath that there's a deeper silence, a quality of emptiness that makes you aware of how small you are, how fragile. The steppe absorbs sound, gives nothing back, offers no echo, no sense of boundary. You've learned not to talk much while traveling. Speech requires energy, requires moisture from your breath, disturbs the steady rhythm of walking. When you do speak, it's practical, a warning about ice, a question about direction, a brief comment about the herd. The rest remains unspoken, held in the shared understanding that comes from living this close to other people, from depending on them absolutely. Hours pass. The sun makes its shallow arc, offering light but little else, and begins its descent. You've covered perhaps half the distance you need. Your mother, walking behind you, moves more slowly than she used to. You've noticed this over the past few seasons. The way her steps have shortened, the way she pauses more often, the way her breathing sounds heavier in the cold air. You don't discuss it. There's nothing to discuss. Aging is as inevitable as winter, and you deal with it by adjusting pace, by offering her lighter tasks, by making sure she's never the last to warm herself at the fire. But you think about it sometimes in the quiet moments. You think about what happens when someone can no longer walk, can no longer contribute to the endless work of survival. The stories hold answers, but they're not comfortable answers. They speak of people who knew when their time had come, who chose to sit in the snow and let the cold take them rather than slow the family, rather than consume resources they could no longer help replenish. You push the thought away. Not today, not for many winters yet, you hope. By the time you reach the forest edge, the light is failing. The trees here are not the tall, strong trees of warmer places. They're stunted, twisted by wind and cold, but they offer some shelter, some break in the relentless openness. You choose a spot, not randomly, but with care, away from the thickest trees where snow might dump from branches, away from the exposed ridge where wind cuts sharpest, near enough to wood for the fire, but not so close that sparks might catch dry branches. The chum goes up again. The routine is soothing in its familiarity, poles arranged in their cone, Hide wrappings tied and secured, the small stones arranged to weight the bottom edge against wind. Inside, as darkness settles complete and absolute, you prepare the evening meal. This is not cooking as you might imagine it. No variety, no seasoning, no pleasure in taste. You have dried fish, so dry it's almost petrified, and you soften it in hot water, creating a thin broth that's more about warmth than flavor. You have fat, precious fat, stored carefully, portioned carefully, and you add a small amount to the broth because your body needs it, because fat is fuel in a way that lean meat cannot be. The children eat without complaint, even though they must be tired of this food, even though you can see in their faces sometimes a kind of weariness that comes not from hunger but from monotony. You eat the same things day after day, week after week, because these are the things that preserve, that travel, that keep you alive. Sometimes, in the brief summer, there are berries, there are bird eggs, there are fish caught fresh from streams. Those memories sustain you through the winter, not the taste itself, which fades quickly, but the idea that flavor exists, that food can be something other than fuel. After eating, there's work still. Always work. Your spouse repairs a tear in the hide covering using sinew thread and a bone needle, working by firelight, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. You work on a boot that's beginning to fail, replacing the dried grass insulation, checking the seams for gaps. Boots are life. You can't think about them enough, can't maintain them too carefully. Your mother tells a story, not a grand story, not an adventure, but a quiet recounting of something her grandmother told her, about a winter when the herd scattered in a storm and took 3 days to gather again, about the fear of those days, about the relief of recovery. The children listen half asleep, and you listen too, even though you've heard this story before. The stories are not entertainment, they're instruction, they're memory storage. They're the way knowledge transfers when nothing is written down. Sleep comes early because there's nothing else to do, because darkness is complete, because your body is tired from walking and cold and the constant low-level work of staying warm. You curl beneath the furs, your family pressed close, and you drift, but you never drift completely. Part of you remains always alert, listening for wind changes, for sounds from the herd, for the tiny indications that something is wrong or about to be wrong. Sleep here is not rest, but a lighter form of vigilance. Morning comes again, and the routine repeats. You wake, you check the herd, you move if you must, you stay if you can, you work constantly at the small tasks that prevent disaster. Days blur together because they're all so similar. The landmarks are subtle, a rock formation barely visible above snow, a particular configuration of trees, a slight rise in the land that means water flows beneath. You navigate by memory and by feel, by the way wind hits your face, by the behavior of the reindeer who sense things you cannot. You're not lost because you've never really been found. You're always in motion, always between places, always temporary. The cold is your constant companion. It shapes every decision, what you wear, how you move, when you stop, what you eat. You've developed an intimate relationship with cold, can read its gradations, its moods. There's the dry cold that burns but can be endured, the wet cold that penetrates everything, the wind-driven cold that finds every gap in your clothing, the still cold of clear nights when temperatures plummet and the stars multiply, and the world becomes almost beautiful in its hostility. You've learned to respect cold without fearing it. Fear is useless. Respect keeps you careful. Frostbite comes in degrees. First, the warning numbness, your nose, your cheeks, your fingertips, telling you they're at their limit. You warm them immediately, tuck your hands into your armpits, cover your face with fur, pay attention. If you ignore the warning, the numbness deepens, the skin pales, and when warmth finally returns, it brings pain, so intense you want to scream. But if you still ignore it, if circumstances force you to continue in the cold, the tissue dies. It turns black, it has to be cut away if infection threatens, and you live with the loss. Shortened fingers, scarred face, the permanent mark of a moment when you didn't or couldn't listen to your body's warnings. You've seen this. Everyone has. The old hunter with 3 fingers on his left hand, the woman with a nose reconstructed from scar tissue, the child who lost both feet and now moves differently, survives differently, depends on others in new ways. These are not stories of tragedy, not exactly. They're stories of continuation. The person survived, adapted, kept living. But they're also warnings, reminders that the margin for error is thin as the ice on a spring pond. Food is always a calculation. You store what you can during summer. Dried fish, dried meat, collected berries mixed with fat and packed into intestine casings, a kind of dense survival cake that keeps through winter. But storage is never enough. You must hunt when possible, must fish through ice, must maintain the herd while also knowing that the herd is your food reserve, that every reindeer represents potential meat, potential fat, potential survival through a hard season. The decision to slaughter is never simple. Each animal is known, has a personality, has contributed to your movement and survival, but sentiment can't outweigh need. When food grows too scarce, when a reindeer is failing anyway, when the calculations tip toward necessity, you act. The killing is quick, respectful. You speak to the animal, thank it, not because you believe it understands words, but because the ritual reminds you that you're taking life, that this matters, that survival is built on death and must be acknowledged. The butchering is complete, efficient, nothing wasted: meat, organs, blood, bone, hide, sinew, hooves. Every part has use, has been transformed by your ancestors into tools, into food, into material. The knowledge of how to use everything is part of what you carry, part of what makes survival possible. Sometimes, despite all care, animals die anyway. They fall through ice, they're taken by wolves, they sicken with diseases you can't name or treat, they simply weaken and lie down and don't rise again. These losses hurt, not because you're sentimental, but because they're practical disasters. Each lost animal is lost protein, lost material, lost insurance against future hardship. You mark the loss, adjust your plans, move on. There's no other choice. The social world here is small, intimate, sometimes suffocating. Your family is your universe. These few people you travel with, work with, depend on absolutely. There's no privacy, no escape. You see each other in every state: sick, exhausted, afraid, angry, grieving. You've learned to read the smallest shifts in mood, the tightness around someone's mouth, the way they hold their shoulders, the quality of their silence. Communication happens in these tiny signals, in what's not said as much as what is. Conflict must be managed carefully. Out here you can't afford grudges, can't afford the kind of explosive fights that fracture relationships. So anger is expressed quietly. Disagreements are resolved through elder mediation. Resentments are set aside, not because they're resolved, but because survival requires cooperation above all else. But still tensions exist. Still there are days when you want to walk away from these people, want silence that's chosen rather than enforced, want to make decisions without consultation or compromise. You don't, of course. Where would you go? Other families exist, moving through their own territories, following their own herds. Sometimes paths intersect, at trading sites, at seasonal gathering places, at rivers where fish run thick enough to support temporary community. These meetings are important. They're where young people find partners, where knowledge exchanges, where stories spread, where the isolation breaks for a brief time. You look forward to these gatherings, but you also find them exhausting. So many voices, so many expectations, so much negotiation and social performance after months of quiet. And they remind you of how small your world is, how few people exist in this vast space, how fragile the web of human connection stretches across the empty lands. The spirit world is not separate from the physical world, it's layered over it, woven through it, present in every rock and stream and significant place. You've been taught since childhood to see this layering, to recognize which places hold power, hold memory, hold danger. There are rules about these places. Don't camp where someone died badly. Don't ignore the small cairns that mark significant spots. Leave offerings at certain passes. Small things, a bit of fat, a carved bone, a whispered acknowledgement. You're not sure sometimes what you believe. The spirits don't appear, don't speak in clear voices, don't intervene obviously in daily life, but you follow the rules anyway because they're part of the accumulated wisdom, because they connect you to your ancestors, because in a landscape this vast and indifferent, any sense of relationship, even to invisible beings, provides some comfort. Dreams matter here more than in places where life is busy and varied. Your dreams are vivid, detailed, sometimes prophetic. You dream of the herd scattering and wake to find them restless. You dream of your grandmother and wake to find your mother sick. The dreams aren't always clear, aren't always accurate, but you've learned to pay attention to them, to carry their warnings into waking life, to discuss them with elders who've learned to read patterns in the chaos of sleep. Sometimes you dream of places you've never been, vast forests, great waters, landscapes that don't exist in your known world. You wonder if these are memories from ancient times, from when your people lived differently, or if they're just the mind's way of escaping the monotony of snow and cold. Your spiritual life is quiet, private. There are shamans, people who've trained in the deep knowledge, who know how to journey in trance, who mediate between worlds. But most of you are not shamans. Your relationship to the sacred is simpler: respect, caution, small rituals, attention to the signs. You murmur words before hunting, you mark certain days with fasting, you teach your children which stories are just stories and which must be listened to with full attention because they contain instructions for survival. The concept of ownership is different here. You don't own the land, the idea makes no sense. The land is simply there, vast and indifferent. You move through it, you use its resources, but you don't possess it. You own your tools, your clothing, your herd, in the sense that you care for them and they care for you. But even this ownership is fluid, temporary. If you die, your belongings are distributed, the herd is divided, and life continues. Nothing is permanent except the land itself, and even the land changes. Rivers shift, forests advance or retreat, the permafrost buckles and reforms. Trade brings strange ideas. Sometimes men from the south appear, Russians usually, seeking furs, seeking roots, seeking to map and name and claim. They talk about borders, about territories belonging to distant powers. They offer metal tools, cloth, sometimes liquor. You trade carefully, taking what's useful, better knives, metal pots, needles, that don't break as easily as bone. But you're wary of the ideas they bring, the way they see the world as something to be divided and possessed. Some families have moved closer to Russian settlements, have begun to settle in one place, have changed their way of living. You hear stories about this, and they're strange to you, the idea of staying in one place, of building permanent structures, of depending on trade rather than the herd. You don't judge these choices. People survive how they survive, but you can't imagine it for yourself. The movement is too deep in you, the rhythm of migration, too fundamental to abandon. Your body has been shaped by this life. Your legs are strong from walking, your back straight from carrying loads, your hands scarred and calloused from 1,000 small injuries and repairs. You're lean. Everyone is lean. There's no possibility of excess here, no storing of fat beyond what's needed for immediate insulation. Your face is weathered, skin darkened and toughened by constant exposure to cold and sun reflecting off snow. Your eyes squint automatically, even when the sun is dim, protecting against the glare. You've lost teeth, not all of them, but enough that chewing tough dried meat requires extra care. There's no dentistry here, no treatment for abscesses beyond pain and waiting, and sometimes death if infection spreads. You're young still by the counting of winters, but you feel old sometimes. The constant work, the constant cold, the constant alertness wears on you in ways that are hard to name. You watch your children and wonder what they'll remember of these years. Will they remember the hardship, the hunger, the cold that never fully left? Or will they remember the quieter things, the way stars multiply on clear nights, the northern lights dancing green and purple across the sky, the particular satisfaction of a well-maintained camp, the taste of fresh fish after weeks of dried food? You hope they'll remember the skills, how to read weather in cloud formations, how to calm a frightened reindeer, how to find south when the sun is hidden, how to walk for hours without exhausting themselves, how to stay alive when every comfort is absent. But you also hope they'll remember being loved, being part of something larger than themselves, being carried by tradition and memory and the accumulated survival knowledge of countless generations. The seasons do change, even here. Winter is longest, but it eventually softens into brief spring, a few weeks when water runs liquid, when the ground thaws enough to squelch under boots, when mosquitoes appear in such numbers they form clouds, when the reindeer shed their winter coats in great matted chunks. Spring is work of a different kind. Calves are born, fragile and long-legged, and must be protected from predators, from late cold snaps, from their own incompetence. The herd moves faster in spring, driven by the sudden abundance of food, and you struggle to keep up, to keep them together, to prevent them from scattering too widely. Summer is brief but intense. The sun barely sets, the light is constant, and you work through exhaustion to make the most of it, gathering, fishing, hunting, repairing everything that broke during winter, preparing for the next cycle of cold. Autumn comes quickly, sharply. The light begins to fail again, the cold returns, and you must be ready. Food stored, hides prepared, routes planned, the herd in good condition. If you're not ready, winter will punish you. It's that simple, that brutal. But now, in the deepest part of winter, those other seasons feel distant, almost imaginary. The cold is all there is, has been for months, will be for months more. You endure because endurance is all you have, because your ancestors endured, because somewhere in the genetic memory is the knowledge that this too will pass, that warmth will return, that life will continue. And there's a kind of pride in this. Not loud, not boastful, but a quiet satisfaction that you can survive where others cannot, that you possess knowledge and skills that keep you alive in one of the most hostile environments humans have ever inhabited. You don't think about this often. You're too busy, too focused on immediate tasks. But sometimes in quiet moments, you feel it, a sense of place, of belonging, not to comfort, but to challenge, to the strange beauty of a world stripped to essentials. The wind rises as night falls, and you're grateful for the chum, for the fire, for the bodies pressed close. Outside, the steppe is empty, frozen, indifferent to your existence. But inside this small circle of warmth, life persists. You sleep, you wake, you continue. This is what it means to be here, to survive here, to live a life measured not in years but in winters endured, in distances travelled, in the slow accumulation of knowledge that might keep your children alive when you're gone. There was a child born during migration, on a day when the sky pressed low and heavy and the herd was restless, sensing weather that hadn't arrived yet. The birth happened quickly, as births sometimes do when the body knows that delay is dangerous, and the infant's first sound was muffled by wind and the soft talking of women who'd done this before, who knew how to make room for new life, even in the midst of movement. They called the child a Chika, which in their language meant something like persistent or one who continues. A good name for a child born in motion, born into a life that would demand constant adaptation. The family wrapped the infant in the softest furs, placed the child in a carrier designed to hang against someone's body, and within a few hours they were moving again, because the herd doesn't wait for human ceremonies, doesn't pause for the profound moment of birth. A Chikta's first memories, the ones that surfaced later, filtered through time and the unreliable nature of early childhood recall, were sensory rather than visual. The rhythm of walking, felt through the body of whoever carried them, became a kind of heartbeat, a fundamental pulse that meant safety, meant continuation. The sound of the drum during evening gatherings, deep and resonant, making the air inside the chum vibrate, making something in the chest respond. The particular quality of light through reindeer hide, muted and warm, creating a small world separate from the vast cold outside. And the smell. Always the smell of smoke and fur and bodies and milk and the slightly metallic tang of very cold air. These were the foundational sensations that built the architecture of memory, that defined what normal meant, what home was, even though home was never in one place. As a Chikta grew, transitioning from infant to child, the learning began in earnest. Not formal teaching, there was no school, no structured curriculum, but the constant immersion in the work of living. Watch how to pack a sled so the weight distributes evenly. Listen to the different sounds reindeer make and what each sound means. Feel the difference between snow that's safe to walk on and snow that conceals weak ice. Taste the bitterness of certain plants that signal poison. Remember that taste. Avoid those plants forever. Every adult was a teacher, every day a lesson, and the consequence of not learning was clear enough that even young children paid attention. A Chikta learned to walk by walking, learned endurance by having no choice but to endure, learned cold by living in it so constantly that warmth became the strange thing, the rare exception. By the time a Chikta had seen perhaps 8 or 9 winters, there was work to be done, real work, not play. The child's hands, still small but already rough from cold and use, learned to repair small tears in hide, learned to sort dried fish, learned to gather snow in containers to melt for water, learned the 1,000 small tasks that free adults for the harder work. There was a particular day, a Chikta would remember this, when the task was to watch the younger children, to keep them close to camp while adults worked on butchering a reindeer that had broken its leg and had to be slaughtered. The younger ones wanted to play, wanted to run, wanted to explore, and a Chikta felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, felt the fear of losing one, of being the reason something terrible happened. Nothing terrible did happen. The day passed, the children were safe, the adults returned, and a Chikta felt something new. A small pride, a sense of having been trusted and having fulfilled that trust. It was a minor moment, barely worth noting, but it marked a transition from being cared for to being capable of care, from being only a receiver to being also a giver. These small transitions accumulated, built the path from childhood towards something more adult, more useful, more integrated into the survival web. By 12 or 13 winters, a Chikta was apprenticed to an uncle, not formally, just through proximity and need, to learn the deeper knowledge of the herd. This uncle was known as someone who could read reindeer behavior, who rarely lost animals, who seemed to anticipate problems before they fully manifested. He didn't teach by explaining, he taught by doing, by bringing a Chikta along, by occasionally grunting a single word of instruction or warning, by letting the younger person watch and absorb and gradually understand. They would walk the herd in the early morning, checking each animal, and the uncle would pause sometimes at one, would touch its flank, would examine its eyes or hooves, would make small sounds of approval or concern. A Chikta learned to see what the uncle saw, the slight limp that indicated hoof problems, the dullness in coat that suggested parasites, the way a healthy animal held its head versus the slight droop that meant exhaustion or illness. There was a morning when a Chika smelled it first, the change in weather. Something in the air, a sharpness, a particular quality of stillness that preceded storms. The uncle noticed a Chika noticing, gave a small nod of approval. "Good," he said. Just that one word, but it meant everything. Meant you're learning, meant you might survive, meant you're becoming someone who can be trusted with knowledge. That storm, when it came, was severe. The wind rose until it screamed, until snow became a solid wall of white, until you couldn't see your own hand extended in front of your face. The family huddled in the chum, securing everything, weighing down the edges with stones and snow, and waited. There was nothing else to do, no fighting storms, no controlling weather, only endurance. The reindeer scattered. They always scattered in bad storms, driven by instinct to turn their backs to wind, to move, to find any shelter. When the storm cleared, 2 days later, the air suddenly calm and cold and crystalline, the herd was gone. Not nearby, not visible anywhere in the white landscape. This was the crisis that a Chika would later mark as the true beginning of adult life. The uncle, despite his age, immediately prepared to search, and a Chika went with him, no question asked, no permission needed. They travelled for 3 days, following barely visible tracks, following instinct, following the uncle's accumulated knowledge of how reindeer think, where they go when frightened. They slept in snow caves, ate only what they carried, rationed everything, because there was no knowing how long the search would take. A Chika learned what cold really meant during those days. Not the cold of everyday life, mitigated by fire and shelter and family, but raw cold, relentless cold, the cold that whispered constantly about death, about the ease of just lying down, about how sleep would feel so good. The uncle never spoke of it, but a Chika could see him fighting the same whispers, could see the way he forced himself to keep moving, to keep searching, to refuse the seductive simplicity of giving up. On the 3rd day, they found the herd, or most of it, huddled in a hollow where wind had scoured away some snow, where they'd found enough lichen to keep them from starving. The uncle counted, his lips moving silently, and his face tightened. 4 missing, not scattered, but missing, truly gone, probably dead, in some drift or ravine, food for wolves, if anything. It was a significant loss, but not a catastrophic one. They gathered the remaining animals, turned them south toward home, and walked for another 2 days, arriving exhausted, frostbitten on fingers and cheeks, but successful enough. A Chika had proven something during those days, though no one said it aloud, had proven the ability to endure, to keep moving when everything hurt, to push past the point where the body begs for rest. The family treated a Chika differently after that. Still young, yes, but no longer quite a child. More responsibility came, more trust, more expectation that a Chika would handle difficult tasks without supervision. The seasons turned as they always did, and a Chika grew into fuller adulthood. There were other tests, other moments of crisis, a fever that lasted weeks and left a Chika weak and hollowed out, a fall through ice that could have drowned but ended with only frozen clothing and terror, a confrontation with a wolverine that damaged 2 reindeer before being driven off. Each crisis was survived, added to the internal catalogue of knowledge, became part of the accumulated experience that separated those who lived long from those who didn't. By the time a Chika had seen perhaps 20 winters, the family began speaking of marriage, of alliance with another family they encountered during summer gatherings. Marriage here was not romance, or not primarily romance. It was practical alliance, the joining of 2 survival units, the exchange of knowledge and genetic diversity and labor. A Chika met the intended spouse during a fishing gathering, a time when several families converged where a river ran thick with migrating fish. The meeting was awkward, formal, both of them aware of being evaluated, being considered as potential partners in the enormous work of continuing life. They spoke little at first, but they worked together, helping to construct fish weirs to dry the catch, to repair nets. And, in the work, they began to understand each other's competence, each other's temperament. The spouse, whose name was Ergute, meaning something like bright sky, was from a family that traveled slightly different routes, that knew different river crossings, different winter shelters, different stories. This difference was valuable. The marriage would bring new knowledge into a Chikta's family, would create connections that might matter in hard times, would allow for more complex movement patterns when resources grew scarce in one territory. They married in the way of their people, simply, with elders speaking blessings, with small gifts exchanged, with a quiet feast of fresh fish and fat, and then they joined a Chikta's family migration, Ergute, leaving behind parents and siblings, becoming part of a new unit. The transition was not easy for Ergute. Nothing about this life was easy, but it was normal, expected, the way families formed and reformed across generations. Together they began building their own smaller section within the larger family structure. They maintained their own portion of the herd, they had their own space within the chum, they began accumulating the tools and materials that would eventually allow them to split off fully if needed. And then children came, first one, then another, then a third. Each birth was both joy and burden, another life to protect, another person who needed food and warmth and teaching, another thread in the fragile web that held everyone together. A Chikta felt the weight of parenthood in ways that no previous responsibility had created. These small people were utterly dependent, completely vulnerable, and their survival required constant vigilance, constant work, constant denial of a Chikta's own needs in favor of theirs. The first child was born during a relatively gentle spring, and a Chikta remembered holding that tiny, wrinkled being, feeling the impossible fragility of new life, understanding suddenly and completely what the parents had felt, what all parents had always felt, this terror mixed with fierce protective love. The second child was born during a harder time, during a winter when food ran low and everyone's faces grew lean and tight with worry. That child was smaller, weaker, struggled to thrive, and a Chikta spent nights barely sleeping, keeping the infant warm against body heat, trying to will life into that small form. The child survived, grew stronger eventually, but those early months marked a Chikta in ways that didn't fade, a new understanding of how precarious everything was, how close death always waited. The third child came during migration, just as a Chikta had been born, and there was something poetically appropriate about that, about the circle completing itself, about life insisting on continuation even in the midst of movement and cold. As the children grew, a Chikta became teacher in turn, passing on what had been learned, watching the next generation struggle with the same lessons, the same fears, the same slow accumulation of competence. It was strange to stand on the other side of that relationship, to be the one with knowledge rather than the one seeking it. A Chikta tried to teach the way the uncle had taught, mostly through action, through letting them watch and try and fail and try again, through offering just enough guidance to prevent disaster, but not so much that they failed to develop their own judgment. The uncle was old now, moving slowly, his face deeply lined, his hands gnarled with arthritis. He spent more time sitting than walking, more time telling stories than working, but his mind was still sharp, his knowledge still valuable. A Chikta sat with him often during evening hours, listening to stories that had been told 100 times, but always contained some small detail previously missed. some nuance that only made sense now that a Chicta had lived long enough to understand. The uncles spoke of changes he'd seen, summers that seemed slightly warmer than in his youth, winters that started later, the gradual appearance of more traders from the south, the slow pressure of outside ideas and outside wants pressing against their traditional ways. He spoke without judgment, just observation, but a Chicta could hear the uncertainty beneath the words, the sense that something fundamental was shifting, that the world their children would inherit might be different in ways that were hard to predict. One winter, Russians appeared, not traders but officials, men in uniforms with papers and demands about taxes, about yasak, the fur tribute that the distant power demanded from all people in these territories. The concept was strange to Achikta's family. Taxes meant acknowledging ownership, meant recognizing authority that had never existed in their experience, meant giving up resources not in trade but in submission. They negotiated carefully, gave some furs, tried to maintain their independence while not provoking conflict with people who had guns, who had the backing of a state that could, if it chose, make life impossible. The encounter left a Chicta troubled, sensing that these men represented something larger, something that would not be satisfied with small tributes, that wanted to map and name and control everything, including people who had never been controlled. But life continued anyway, because what else could it do? The herd still needed tending, the seasons still cycled, the children still needed feeding and teaching and protecting. A Chicta was middle-aged now, no longer young, not yet old, in that long plateau of life where strength and experience balanced, where the body was still capable but beginning to show signs of eventual decline. There were grey hairs now, and joints that ached more in deep cold, and a certain tiredness that came not from any specific exertion, but from the accumulated weight of years lived hard. But there was also confidence, competence, the deep knowledge that came from repetition, from having survived so many winters, from having solved so many problems. Then came a year that would mark a Chicta's life more deeply than any before, a year when nature revealed its cruelest face, when all the careful preparation and accumulated knowledge proved barely enough. The winter started early, arrived with sudden ferocity in late autumn before the family was fully ready. The cold came deeper than usual, stayed longer than usual, and the snow fell so thick and constant that finding forage for the herd became desperate work. They moved more frequently than normal, searching for areas where wind had blown snow thin, where the reindeer could pour down to lichen, but even those places grew scarce. The herd began to weaken. You could see ribs through their thick winter coats, could see the exhaustion in the way they moved, the way they stood with heads low, conserving every bit of energy. The family made the hard decision to slaughter more animals than planned, to thin the herd to reduce grazing pressure, to provide meat that would see them through if the winter refused to release its grip. Each slaughter was necessary, but each one also meant fewer animals for next year, fewer resources for recovery, a gamble that spring would come in time, and the remaining herd would be enough to rebuild from. The meat helped, but it wasn't enough. Hunger became constant, not starvation, not yet, but the slow, grinding awareness that every meal was smaller than it should be, that bodies were consuming themselves, that strength was slowly draining away. A Chicta's youngest child grew listless, stopped playing, sat quietly, with eyes that looked too large in a thinning face. The elder child, now old enough to understand, said nothing, but a Chicta could see the fear there, the awareness that something was seriously wrong. Ergute grew quiet, withdrew into some internal space, and a Chicta couldn't reach them, couldn't offer comfort that felt real when everything was so uncertain. The uncle died during that winter, quietly, in sleep, as if he'd simply decided that enough was enough, that he'd lived long and seen much, and now It was time to rest. They prepared his body according to tradition, built a platform of the precious wood they'd saved for emergencies, laid him there wrapped in his best furs with his drum beside him, and left him to the sky and the birds and whatever came after. His death was a loss of knowledge, of memory, of the link to previous generations, and it left a Chika feeling untethered, feeling the weight of now being one of the older generation, one of the keepers of knowledge, one of the people younger ones would look to. Spring, when it finally came, was late and grudging. The snow melted slowly, the ice broke up later than normal, and the world emerged muddy and exhausted, as if winter had taken something essential from the land itself. The family counted their losses, half the herd gone, the uncle gone, 2 other elders who'd simply weakened past the point of recovery, and everyone who remained marked by the experience, carrying it in their bodies, in their memories. A Chika made a decision during that difficult spring. They would push north, beyond their usual territory, into lands that were less familiar, but where grazing might be better, where the herd could recover, where they could rebuild what had been lost. It was a risk. Unfamiliar territory meant unknown dangers, meant losing the advantage of inherited knowledge about where water flowed, where shelter could be found, where the best grazing existed. But staying in depleted territory seemed equally risky, seemed like a slow continuation of the previous winter's privation. Ergute supported the decision. The children were too young to have meaningful opinions, and the few remaining elders simply nodded, trusting in a Chika's judgment, having no better alternatives to suggest. They traveled north through that summer, moving slowly, learning the new land, gradually mapping it through experience. The territory was different, slightly warmer, with more trees, with different patterns of water and stone, with lakes that held fish they'd never seen before. The herd responded well to new grazing, began to put on weight, began to show signs of health returning. The family adapted, learned, survived, and slowly the trauma of the hard winter began to recede, became a story, became a lesson, became part of the accumulated knowledge that defined who they were. A Chika aged into later life, watching the children grow into their own competence, watching them begin to make their own decisions, their own journeys. The eldest left to join another family, married into a different migration pattern, and a Chika felt the bittersweet ache of that separation, pride in the child's independence, mixed with the loss of daily presence, of knowing exactly where they were, of being able to protect them. The other children remained for now, and a Chika taught them everything possible, knowing that memory was the only inheritance that mattered, that survival skills passed down were worth more than any material wealth. By the time a Chika had seen perhaps 50 winters, though the exact count had long ago ceased to matter, there was a certain peace that came from acceptance, from understanding that life here was always hard, always precarious, but also always continuing, always adapting, always finding ways forward. The body was slower now, more prone to injury, less able to withstand the extremes. A Chika took on different work, more supervision, more teaching, more maintaining of camp, while younger people handled the physically demanding tasks. There was no shame in this transition. It was natural, expected, the way generations moved through their roles, each person contributing what they could at each stage of life. Ergute too had aged, had become someone a Chika knew so completely that words were often unnecessary, that a glance could communicate complex thoughts, that silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. They'd built a life together through shared struggle, shared loss, shared small victories, and whatever romance had or hadn't been there at the beginning had been transformed into something deeper, more enduring. Partnership, mutual reliance, the profound intimacy that comes from surviving together. The grandchildren appeared, small and helpless and infinitely precious, and Chika felt the circle completing again, felt the strange satisfaction of seeing life continue beyond one's own immediate scope. There was a winter evening. Chika was old now, truly old, moving carefully, breathing with effort. When a grandchild asked for a story, and Chika told about the great storm, the lost herd, the 3 days of searching in killing cold, the child listened with wide eyes, asked questions, wanted to know if Chika had been afraid. Yes, Chika said simply, always afraid. But fear doesn't stop you, it just walks beside you and you do what needs doing anyway. The child seemed satisfied with that answer, curled closer against Chika's side and drifted towards sleep. Chika sat there in the firelight, surrounded by family, by the sounds of quiet breathing and the crackle of flames and the wind outside the chum, and felt something like contentment. Not happiness, that was too large a word for a life lived this hard, but contentment, acceptance, the sense that this was a life fully lived, that the struggles had meaning, that the continuation of family and tradition and knowledge was its own kind of victory against the vast indifference of the frozen world. When death came for Chika, and it came quietly, in sleep, during a period of relative calm, the family mourned as they always mourned, with quiet tears and with action. They prepared the body, built the platform, spoke the words that released the spirit, and left Chika to the sky. The reindeer, when the family moved on, circled once around the burial site, instinct or respect or simply coincidence, and then continued their eternal migration. Chika's life had been ordinary in all the ways that mattered here. No great deeds, no dramatic heroism, just the slow accumulation of survival, of knowledge passed forward, of children raised and family maintained, and the endless work of continuing. But in that ordinariness was something profound, the quiet persistence of human life in places that seemed designed to forbid it, the refusal to yield even when everything was hard, the insistence that life had value, had meaning, had purpose beyond mere endurance. In the world of the Siberian nomads, the landscape was never simply landscape. It was inhabited, crowded with invisible presences, with memories that lived in places rather than in written records. Every significant location had personality, had history, had relationships that extended back through time beyond the reach of individual memory into the realm of collective story. The wind itself carried knowledge, whispered warnings through the sparse groves of larch and pine, shaped the snow into patterns that those who knew how to look could read like text. The nomads moved through this terrain not as conquerors or even as explorers, but as participants in an ongoing conversation between human need and natural reality, between the visible world and the invisible forces that animated it. There was a lake, several days' journey from where Chika's family sometimes travelled, that was known to be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with thin ice or deep water. People avoided camping too close to its shores, would not fish there even when hungry, would quiet their voices when passing nearby. The lake sat in a depression between low hills, its surface dark even in summer, reflecting the sky like polished obsidian. In winter, when ice covered it, the surface remained strangely clear in places, as though something beneath refused to be obscured, insisted on visibility even through frozen layers. Why? The stories varied in detail but agreed in essence. Something had happened there long ago, something violent or profoundly wrong. And the place remembered, the place held on to that wrongness, and people who ignored the warnings sometimes disappeared, sometimes fell ill, sometimes returned, changed in ways that frightened their families. One version of the story spoke of a massacre, a family group caught by raiders from a distant tribe, their blood staining the water, their final screams absorbed into the earth around the shore. Another version told of a shaman who had turned to dark practices, who had tried to summon powers that should not be summoned, and whose failed ritual had torn a hole in the fabric of normal reality, leaving the place wounded, bleeding invisible poison into its surrounding. Still another spoke simply of wrongness without cause. The lake had always been this way, had been avoided since the oldest ancestors could remember, its danger so ancient that the reason had been forgotten, but the prohibition remained as strong as ever. Was this literally true? Did spirits actually inhabit the lake? Did they actually harm people who trespassed? Or was the taboo simply practical knowledge wrapped in supernatural explanation? Perhaps the lake harbored some disease, perhaps unusual mineral content in the water caused illness when consumed. Perhaps the geography was treacherous in non-obvious ways, with sudden drop-offs or underwater currents that could pull a person down without warning. Perhaps the taboo existed to prevent people from dispersing too widely, from losing themselves in territory too far from help. The nomads didn't analyze these questions. They simply followed the rules, made the small offerings, gave the place respect and distance, and continued safely. When passing within sight of the lake, travelers would pause to leave a small token, a scrap of cloth tied to a branch, a smooth stone placed on a cairn that had accumulated over generations, a few drops of precious vodka poured onto the ground. These offerings were not grand gestures, but small acknowledgements, ways of saying, "We see you, we respect what happened here, we do not presume to forget or to trespass without recognition." The spirit geography was complex, layered, constantly present in daily life. Trees could be dangerous, not all trees, but certain ones, old ones, ones with particular growth patterns or locations. A larch that grew twisted against prevailing winds, its trunk spiraling in ways that spoke of some internal struggle or external force, was not a tree to approach carelessly. A solitary pine standing in open tundra where no other trees grew, surviving somehow against all odds, was clearly special, clearly connected to powers that ordinary vegetation did not possess. You didn't use such trees for firewood, didn't camp beneath them, didn't damage them thoughtlessly. To do so risked offense, risked bringing bad luck. Animals would avoid you, weather would turn, injuries would multiply. A hunter who cut a sacred tree might find that his arrows flew wide for weeks afterward, that the caribou seemed to sense his presence from impossible distances, that small accidents accumulated until serious harm resulted. A family that camped beneath a spirit tree might wake to find their dogs restless and whining, their children feverish, their supplies somehow scattered or spoiled despite all precautions. Again, the line between supernatural belief and practical observation blurred. Perhaps those trees marked underground water that made camping there damp and unhealthy. Perhaps they were associated with animal paths that brought predators nearby. Perhaps the belief itself served as environmental protection, preventing overuse of certain resources. Or perhaps in a landscape where survival depended on reading subtle signs, the trees actually did mark something real. Magnetic anomalies, unusual mineral deposits, the presence of gas seeps or other environmental hazards that human senses could detect only subconsciously through unease and instinct rather than conscious analysis. The shamans, the men and women who'd undergone the long, difficult training, who'd learned to journey in trance, who mediated between the visible and invisible worlds, understood these complications, these layers of meaning. Their work was not simple superstition, but a complex practice that combined psychological insight, medicinal knowledge, social management, and spiritual experience into something that served the community in multiple ways. A shaman's training might last years, even decades, involving periods of isolation, fasting, the deliberate cultivation of visionary states through techniques passed down through lineages of practice. A shaman might diagnose illness by entering trance, by journeying to spirit realms to discover what had been offended, what needed to be corrected. But that journey would also give time for the sick person to rest, would create a ritual framework that reduced anxiety, would often be accompanied by herbal treatments that had real pharmacological effects, would mobilize community support, around the suffering person. The ceremony itself became a social event, gathering the extended family and sometimes neighbors, creating an atmosphere of collective intention and care that had tangible psychological benefits for someone struggling with illness or injury. The rhythm of the drum, the smoke of burning herbs, the focused attention of the community, all these elements worked together to create an environment where healing became possible, whether through spiritual intervention or through the body's own capacity to recover when given proper conditions. Was the spirit journey real? The shamans believed it was. They experienced it as real, returned with vivid accounts of the places they'd visited, the beings they'd encountered, the negotiations they'd conducted. They spoke of climbing through layers of sky, each layer a different shade of blue or grey or violet, until reaching realms where ancestors dwelled, or where animal spirits gathered in councils that determined the fate of human hunters. They described descending through cracks in the earth, following roots of the world tree downward into caverns lit by phosphorescent fungi or by the glow of mineral veins, meeting beings who were neither human nor animal, but something older, something that had existed before the current world took its present form. And whether or not those experiences existed in some objective sense, they worked. People recovered, communities found resolution, the complex web of belief and practice and social structure held together. The drum was central to shamanic practice, not just any drum but specific drums, constructed with great care, often from the hide of a reindeer that had been specially selected, that had been killed ritually, that was understood to be giving its skin not just as material, but as voice. The selection of the reindeer was itself a spiritual act, requiring visions or signs that indicated which animal was willing, which animal's spirit would cooperate in the work of bridging worlds. The killing was done with ceremony and apology, with explanations offered to the reindeer's spirit, with promises that its sacrifice would serve purposes that mattered, that extended beyond mere human convenience into the realm of cosmic necessity. The drum's sound was not simply rhythm but communication, vibration that carried the shaman's spirit out of ordinary consciousness, that called helpful beings, that pushed away malevolent ones, that created a sonic environment where trance became possible. The construction of a drum was itself a ritual process, choosing the wood for the frame, treating the hide, painting symbols whose meanings were often private to the individual shaman, passed down through lineages of training, modified by personal visions and experiences. The frame might be shaped from birch, carved and bent while green, then dried into a hoop that rang with particular tones when struck. The hide had to be stretched and dried with exact tension. Too loose, and the sound would be muddy and indistinct. Too tight, and it would crack in the brutal cold of winter ceremonies held in unheated spaces under open sky. Each drum had personality, had moods, had times when it spoke clearly, and times when it remained stubbornly silent. Shamans spoke of their drums almost as partners, as beings with whom they worked rather than tools they used. A shaman might apologize to a drum that wasn't cooperating, might make offerings to it, might set it aside for days or weeks until the proper relationship had been restored. On rare occasions, a drum would crack or break beyond repair, and the shaman would mourn it as they would mourn a human companion, holding ceremonies to release its spirit, to thank it for its service, to allow both drum and shaman to move forward. And listeners who'd heard many drummings could distinguish between them, could recognize individual drums by their tone, their voice, their particular character. In trance, shamans reported traveling to places that followed strange geography. Upper worlds reached by climbing the cosmic tree, lower worlds accessed through holes in the earth, middle worlds that overlapped with ordinary reality but revealed its hidden dimensions. The cosmic tree grew at the center of everything, its roots penetrating to the deepest underworlds, its branches spreading through all the layers of sky, its trunk the axis around which all existence revolved. Some shamans describe this tree as birch, others as larch, still others as something that had no earthly counterpart, that existed in spirit form only, visible to those who travelled in trance, but invisible to ordinary sight. These worlds were inhabited by various beings: ancestors who transformed after death, animal spirits who possessed knowledge and power, guardian entities who protected certain families or locations, trickster figures who might help or harm depending on their mood and how they were approached. The shamans brought back information from these journeys: warnings about coming weather, advice about when to move or stay, diagnoses of illness, resolutions to social conflicts, reassurance that the dead had traveled safely to wherever the dead go. Sometimes the information was specific and verifiable. A shaman would return from trance to announce that caribou were gathering 3 days' journey to the east, and when scouts were sent, they would find it exactly as described. Other times, the information was more ambiguous, more interpretive, requiring communal discussion to extract meaning and determine appropriate action. How much of this was genuine visionary experience, and how much was skilled interpretation of subtle social and environmental cues? The question would have seemed strange to the people involved. For them, there was no firm boundary between internal vision and external reality, between psychological truth and spirit truth. A shaman who claimed to have learned something from an animal spirit might well have learned it by observing animal behavior with extraordinary attention, by noticing patterns that others missed, but that didn't make the spirit encounter any less real. The spirit and the observation were not separate things, but two aspects of a single process of knowing. Both were real, both mattered, both had consequences. The framework of spirit communication gave structure to intuition, gave authority to observations that might otherwise have been dismissed, created a channel through which knowledge could flow from subconscious awareness into conscious decision-making. There were objects that carried power, amulets made from bone or stone or metal, carved with symbols, worn against the body for protection. Some were very old, passed down through many generations, their origins lost to memory, their original meanings eroded but their importance undiminished. An amulet might be a bear's tooth, drilled and strung on sinew, the tooth yellow-brown with age, polished by generations of wear against human skin. It might be a small carved figure, barely recognizable as human or animal, its features worn smooth, its purpose mysterious, but its potency unquestioned because it had been worn by a great hunter, by a woman who had survived childbirth 7 times, by an elder who had lived through famines and raids and all manner of hardship to die peacefully in old age. A person might wear several amulets, one for protection in travel, one for hunting success, one for health, one that had belonged to a beloved grandparent and now carried their memory and blessing. The amulets accumulated around a person's neck or sewn into clothing, each one a node in a network of protection, each one a reminder of connection to powers and histories larger than individual existence. Children received their first amulets at naming ceremonies, tiny objects given by parents or grandparents or shamans, objects that would be worn continuously, that would become as much a part of the person as their own skin. The amulets were not magical in any simple sense. They didn't guarantee safety or success, but they served as reminders, as focal points for intention, as links to larger powers and longer histories. Wearing them was a way of saying, I am not alone, I am connected to forces beyond myself, I have help. And that psychological effect, that sense of being supported and protected, had real consequences for behavior, for confidence, for the subtle ways that belief shapes action. A hunter who wore his grandfather's amulet might take risks he would otherwise avoid, might pursue game into dangerous terrain, and whether his success came from supernatural protection or from enhanced confidence that allowed for better performance was ultimately irrelevant. The outcome was the same. There were burial sites scattered across the territory, platforms built above ground where bodies were laid, wrapped in their best furs, sometimes with their tools beside them, left to the sky and the elements. The practice had practical origins. Digging graves in permafrost was nearly impossible, and elevation protected bodies from scavengers, at least temporarily. The platforms were constructed with care, even in times of hardship, even when the living could barely spare the time or materials. Logs would be cut and shaped, lashed together with sinew or rawhide, raised on posts to a height above what wolves or foxes could easily reach. But it also had spiritual significance. The elevation was understood as releasing the spirit, as allowing it to travel upward, as preventing it from being trapped in the earth. The sky burial allowed the person's essence to dissipate naturally, to join with wind and light, to become part of the vast circulation of energy that animated all existence. Some believed that birds, ravens especially, but also hawks and eagles, served as psychopomps carrying pieces of the dead person's spirit to appropriate destinations in the layered geography of the afterlife. Or perhaps the elevation was about allowing the body to return to the cycle of nature gradually, to be cleaned by birds and weather, to be scattered and dispersed rather than contained. The meanings were multiple, layered, not always clearly articulated even by people who practiced the custom faithfully. When asked why they did things this way, elders might shrug, might say simply, "This is how it's done," might offer several contradictory explanations in the same breath, comfortable with the ambiguity, with the multiplicity of meanings that accumulated around any important practice. Archaeology, when it came eventually to these regions, struggled with these burial sites. The wooden platforms rotted, collapsed, scattered their contents, making it difficult to reconstruct exactly how bodies had been positioned, what grave goods had been included. The harsh climate preserved some things beautifully. Organic materials that would have decayed quickly in warmer regions sometimes lasted for centuries. But it also destroyed other things, froze and shattered them, made the archaeological record fragmentary and frustrating. Leather and fur might survive in remarkable condition, stitching still intact, decorative elements still visible, offering glimpses of artistic sophistication and technical skill, but bone might be cracked and scattered by frost action, wood reduced to powder, metal objects corroded by minerals in the soil, or dissolved by acidic conditions created by decomposing organic matter. What did survive told stories that were both illuminating and incomplete. Evidence of long-distance trade in amber and metal, evidence of craft sophistication in carved ivory objects, evidence of diet and disease and injury patterns, evidence of deep time depth in human habitation of these regions. But the spiritual meanings, the symbolic resonances, the stories that gave context to the objects, those were lost, or partially lost, accessible only through ethnographic work with living descendant communities, through careful interpretation that acknowledged its own limitation. An archaeologist might find a carved ivory comb, might marvel at the delicacy of its teeth, the intricacy of the animal figures carved into its handle, but could only speculate about whether it had been purely utilitarian or ceremonial, whether it had belonged to someone of high status or was simply a cherished personal possession, whether the animal figures represented clan totems or hunting magic or purely aesthetic choices. There were ancient campsites, barely visible, just darker patches in soil where fires had burned repeatedly, just faint scatters of bone fragments and stone tools, just subtle depressions where structures had once stood. Carbon dating pushed some of these sites back thousands of years, revealing that people had lived in these regions far longer than written history recorded, that the nomadic way of life was not primitive or recent, but ancient, sophisticated, successfully adapted across millennia. Some sites showed evidence of seasonal reoccupation over centuries, suggesting that knowledge of good camping locations was itself a valuable inheritance, passed down through generations, part of the mental map that allowed survival in demanding environments. A favorable site might offer protection from prevailing winds, access to water, good visibility for watching game movements, proximity to resources like stone suitable for tool making or wood for fuel. The same locations would be used again and again, the accumulated debris of human occupation building up in layers that archaeologists could read like history books, each layer representing a moment in time, a group of people who had stopped here, lived here briefly, moved on. Some sites contained mysteries, tools made from materials that didn't occur locally, suggesting trade networks or migration routes that stretched across vast distances. Ivory carvings of animals that didn't live in Siberia, suggesting either very long-distance contact or very old memories from times when people lived elsewhere. Obsidian from volcanic regions hundreds of miles away, shaped into blades of remarkable sharpness, spoke of exchange systems that connected disparate communities across landscapes that seemed impossibly large and empty. Shells from distant seas, pierced for stringing into ornaments, had traveled through countless hands to end up here, each exchange representing a moment of interaction, of relationship, of the human tendency to desire beautiful things even in the harshest circumstances. Astronomical markers aligned with solstices, suggesting systematic observation of celestial movements, suggesting knowledge systems more complex than the simple stereotype of primitive nomads would allow. But the interpretation of these sites was difficult, contested, uncertain. Without writing, without clear cultural continuity, archaeologists could only hypothesize, could only offer tentative reconstructions that might or might not reflect the reality of how people actually lived, what they actually believed, why they made the choices they made. The danger of projection was constant, of assuming that ancient peoples thought like modern peoples, of importing contemporary categories and concerns into contexts where they might not apply. The northern lights, the aurora borealis, appeared frequently in winter, especially during the darkest months, sweeping across the sky in curtains of green and purple, and sometimes red, silent and moving and utterly mysterious. The nomads had various explanations for them. Some said they were spirits of the dead dancing, some said they were messages from distant ancestors, some said they were battles being fought in the sky world, some said they were the breath of great animals who lived beyond the edge of the world. One story described the lights as reflections from the scales of a cosmic fish that swam through the rivers of the sky, its movements creating the shimmering patterns that humans witnessed from below. Another spoke of a celestial forge where spirits worked metal, the lights being sparks from their hammering, signs that weapons and tools were being prepared for purposes beyond human understanding. The explanations varied between families, between regions, between individual shamans who'd received different visions. There was no single orthodox interpretation, no dogmatic insistence on one correct meaning. The lights were simply there, beautiful and strange and impossible to ignore, and people responded to them with awe, with respect, with the quiet acknowledgement that the world contained more than human understanding could fully capture. Children were taught to be quiet when the lights appeared, to watch respectfully, to avoid pointing or calling attention to themselves in ways that might be construed as disrespectful. Adults would stand outside their shelters, necks craned upward, breathing visible in the cold air, watching the sky perform its inexplicable dance. The silence during these viewings was profound, broken only by the crack of ice, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of wind through bare branches. Why? Perhaps because loud noise or sudden movement might disturb whatever beings or forces were manifesting in the sky, might draw unwanted attention, might be dangerous in ways that were hard to specify but felt intuitively real. Or perhaps the rule simply served to create a sense of sacred time, a moment of shared wonder that bound the community together, that reminded everyone of their small place in a vast and mysterious universe. The aurora might last minutes or hours, might pulse and shift or hang steady, might fill the entire visible sky or appear as narrow bands near the horizon. There were stories, many stories, about people who'd broken taboos and suffered consequences, about hunters who'd killed sacred animals and lost their ability to hunt, about families who'd camped in forbidden places and been struck by sickness, about individuals who'd offended spirits and wandered lost until they died. These stories served as warning, as instruction, as social control. They reinforced the rules, made abstract prohibitions concrete through narrative, created a framework of cause and consequence that helped maintain order and safety. A young man who thought he knew better, who scoffed at the warnings about a particular valley, who camped there despite advice to the contrary, and who then developed a mysterious fever that lasted weeks. This became a story that would be told for generations, a cautionary tale that preserved knowledge about real dangers in memorable form. Were the stories true? Some were probably based on real events. Someone had camped in that place and gotten sick, though perhaps from environmental factors rather than spirit anger. Certain valleys might trap cold air, creating conditions that promoted respiratory illness, or might harbor higher concentrations of disease-carrying insects, or might have water contaminated by mineral runoff that caused gastric distress. The supernatural explanation provided a framework for remembering the danger without requiring understanding of the mechanism. Some were likely exaggerated or invented, teaching stories that used dramatic consequences to ensure the lessons were remembered. The truth value was less important than the functional value. The stories worked, they kept people safe, they preserved knowledge about real dangers while embedding that knowledge in memorable, emotionally resonant narrative form. A child who heard about the hunter who bled from his eyes after killing a white caribou would remember never to harm such an animal, whether or not the original event had actually occurred as described. The vividness of the story, the specificity of the consequence, made it unforgettable in ways that abstract prohibition could never achieve. There were linguistic hints at deeper history, words that seemed borrowed from languages spoken far to the south, grammatical structures that suggested ancient contact with other peoples, place names whose meanings had been forgotten but whose sounds persisted. Linguists and anthropologists working much later tried to reconstruct migration patterns from these clues, tried to trace the deep history of how people had come to inhabit these frozen regions, where they'd come from originally, what routes they'd traveled. Some words for snow and ice showed extraordinary specificity, 13 different terms for various types of snow, each describing not just appearance but behavior, how it would pack, how it would melt, how it would affect travel conditions. This linguistic richness spoke to centuries of careful observation, of survival depending on reading frozen precipitation with life or death accuracy. The reconstructions were tentative, based on limited evidence, often contradictory. Some suggested migration from southern Siberia northward over thousands of years, following game animals, adapting gradually to increasingly harsh conditions. Other theories proposed coastal migration routes, with people following shorelines, living off marine resources before moving inland. Still others posited multiple origins, convergent evolution of similar adaptations by peoples who arrived in the region through different routes and at different times. Some suggested multiple waves of migration, different groups arriving at different times, intermingling or competing or coexisting in complex patterns that left no clear archaeological signature. The nomads themselves had origin stories, mythological accounts of how their ancestors had come to these lands, how they'd learned to survive, how they'd gained the knowledge and skills that made life possible. These stories were not history in the modern sense. They compressed time. They mixed historical memory with symbolic meaning. They explained not just what happened, but why it mattered, what it meant for present-day identity and practice. Some stories spoke of a time when people lived differently, when they dwelled in warmer lands, when food was more abundant, when life was easier. In these accounts, the ancestors had lived in places where berries grew year-round, where hunting required less skill because animals were plentiful and trusting, where shelter could be simple because winters were mild. The stories described gardens and permanent houses, community gatherings in summer warmth, elders living to great ages because life was not so hard. Then some great change, a cooling of climate, a disaster, a divine punishment or test, drove them north, forced them to adapt, to become who they were now. Were these stories memory of actual climatic shifts, of the gradual cooling that turned once temperate regions into tundra? Or were they simply expressions of the universal human sense that there must have been a better time, an easier time, that hardship is deviation from some lost golden age? Both possibilities existed simultaneously. The stories could contain real historical echoes, while also serving present psychological and social needs. The tales of a better time might help people endure current hardship, might provide hope that things could change again, might explain suffering not as meaningless, but as part of a larger cosmic narrative that gave even pain its purpose and place. There were sacred objects that appeared occasionally, found in melting ice, unearthed when digging for other purposes, discovered in old burial sites, whose purposes were unclear, whose origins were mysterious. A beautifully carved box containing what seemed to be gaming pieces or divination tools, the rules for using them completely lost. The box itself was remarkable, made from wood that didn't grow in the region, inlaid with patterns that suggested cosmological significance, hinged with cunning that spoke of sophisticated woodworking traditions. Inside, the pieces were carved from ivory and bone and coloured stone, some marked with symbols, others blank, their arrangement suggesting some kind of system, some way of generating meaning or making decisions that had been important enough to merit such careful craftsmanship. A metal disc covered in symbols that no one could read, that might have been decorative, or might have been some kind of calendar or astronomical instrument. The metal was bronze, rare in regions where copper and tin both had to be imported from vast distances, speaking of trade networks or cultural contacts that implied complex social organization. The symbols included spirals and angular patterns, astronomical markers, representations that might have been numbers or might have been purely decorative. Their meaning lost when the culture that created them disappeared or transformed beyond recognition. A strand of beads made from materials that had traveled thousands of miles to end up here, buried with someone whose identity had vanished into time. The beads included jade from mountain regions to the south, shells from tropical seas, amber from Baltic shores, each bead representing not just distance, but relationships, exchange networks, the movement of goods and ideas across landscapes and peoples that modern maps made to seem impossibly remote from each other. These objects tantalized, suggested depths of culture and sophistication that the harsh conditions of nomadic life didn't immediately reveal. They reminded anyone who found them that people had always been complex, had always created beauty and meaning beyond mere survival, had always asked questions about the nature of reality and sought answers through art and ritual and systematic thought. But the objects remained largely inscrutable, their meanings inaccessible, their stories lost. They existed as beautiful mysteries, as reminders that history is always incomplete, that much of what humans have done and thought and believed simply vanishes, leaves no trace, becomes irrecoverable. Museums would eventually house these objects, display them behind glass with labels that read "purpose unknown" or possibly ceremonial. The very vagueness of the descriptions testament to how much had been lost, how much could never be recovered. The shamans sometimes spoke of dream time, of a layer of reality where past and present and future blurred together, where the dead could speak with the living, where events that hadn't happened yet cast shadows backward into the present. This was not time travel in any science fiction sense, but a different conception of temporality entirely, less linear, more cyclical, or perhaps more accurately spherical, where everything existed simultaneously in different densities of manifestation. In dreams, people met their ancestors, received advice, gained knowledge they couldn't have acquired through ordinary means. A woman might dream of her grandmother teaching her a medicinal technique she had never been taught in waking life, then wake to apply it successfully to a sick child, the knowledge somehow transferred through the dream meeting. A hunter might dream of a place he had never visited, see it in exact detail, then recognize it weeks later when his travels brought him there, the dream having somehow accessed information that existed outside normal perceptual channels. In dreams, they saw places they'd never visited, but would later recognize when they arrived. In dreams, they experienced events that hadn't happened yet, but would, giving them preparation or warning that sometimes made the difference between life and death. A man might dream of an avalanche, of being buried in snow, of struggling for breath, and the vividness of the dream would cause him to alter his planned route through a mountain pass. And that day, on the route he would have taken, an avalanche would thunder down, would have killed him if he had been there. Were these actual prophetic dreams or simply the mind's pattern recognition capacity working with incomplete information to make probabilistic forecasts? The question would have seemed meaningless to the people involved. Dreams were real experiences that produced real knowledge, and the mechanism by which that happened was less important than the results. There were places where time seemed strange, where distances didn't work the way they should, where a journey that should take days could be completed in hours, or where hours could pass like days. The nomads knew these places, marked them in memory, approached them with caution. Some were mountain passes where weather could change with disorienting speed, where a traveler might set out in clear conditions and within minutes be engulfed in blizzard so complete that up and down became meaningless, where time stretched or compressed because all reference points disappeared. Others were valleys where fog settled with peculiar persistence, where visibility dropped to arm's length, where people walked in circles without realizing it, where the usual methods of navigation failed. Perhaps they were places where magnetic anomalies affected perception, or where geographic features created illusions of distance, or where psychological factors, exhaustion, hypoxia, sensory deprivation, produced altered states that warped the experience of time and space. Or perhaps they were simply thin places where the boundary between ordinary reality and something else grew permeable, where the rules that normally governed experience loosened just enough to allow strangeness through. The strangeness was accepted, incorporated into the map of the world, navigated with the same practical caution that guided all interactions with a dangerous environment. You didn't need to understand why a place was strange to know that it was, to adjust your behavior accordingly, to survive by respecting what you couldn't explain. A hunter who found himself in such a place would not waste energy trying to rationalize or understand. He would simply move through it with heightened awareness, with extra attention to his surroundings, with the knowledge that normal assumptions might not apply until he reached more stable ground. In the endless winter, under the low grey sky, in the vast white silence, mysteries accumulated like snow. Layer upon layer of unknowing, of questions without answers, of beauty and strangeness that exceeded human capacity to fully comprehend or control. The nomads lived within that mystery rather than trying to eliminate it, carried their questions without demanding resolution, found meaning not in certainty, but in the ongoing relationship with a world that remained fundamentally other, fundamentally beyond complete understanding. The landscape taught humility, taught the limits of human knowledge and control, taught that survival sometimes depended not on understanding but on respect, on listening, on moving carefully through a world that operated according to its own logic. and purpose. The cold itself was a presence, not mere absence of heat, but something active, something that searched for weakness, that found gaps in clothing, that turned breath to ice, that could kill with startling efficiency. And perhaps that was itself a kind of wisdom, the acceptance of mystery, the comfort with not knowing, the ability to live richly and meaningfully within a reality that refused to be fully explained or fully mastered. The snow kept its secrets, and the people kept moving, and the ancient dance between human persistence and natural indifference continued, as it had for thousands of years, as it would for however long the world allowed. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, mapping time through celestial geography, providing orientation to those who knew how to read them. The moon waxed and waned, pulling tides in distant oceans and something less measurable in human hearts and minds. The seasons turned with inexorable rhythm, the brief, intense summer when life exploded in frantic productivity, the long, dying autumn when everything prepared for darkness, the winter that seemed it might last forever, the tentative spring when hope returned, like a rumor whispered through the warming air. And through all of it, the people endured, adapted, passed their knowledge forward, added their own stories to the vast accumulation of narrative that constituted their history and their identity. They were not victims of their environment, but participants in it, not conquered by hardship, but shaped by it into forms that could survive and even flourish in conditions that would have destroyed peoples less attuned to subtle signals, less willing to bend rather than break. Their wisdom was not written in books but lived in practice, not abstracted into theory but embedded in the 10,000 small decisions that filled each day. How to read the quality of snow underfoot, how to predict weather from the behavior of birds, how to find water under ice, how to preserve meat through summer heat, how to keep tools functional in extreme cold, how to navigate when landmarks disappeared under snowfall, all this and more constituted a body of knowledge as sophisticated as any agricultural civilization's understanding of planting and harvesting, as complex as any urban society's grasp of social organization. And woven through all the practical knowledge was the spiritual framework that gave it context and meaning, that transformed mere survival into something richer, something that acknowledged the sacred in the ordinary, that saw in every action a relationship with forces larger than human concern. The fire that warmed was also a spirit that required respect and offering. The game that fed was also kin that died to provide life, that deserved gratitude and ceremony. The land that supported was also ancestor, also teacher, also judge. Nothing was merely itself. Everything participated in networks of relationship that extended horizontally across space and vertically through time, that connected the visible and invisible, the living and the dead, the human and the more than human. And in this worldview, what modern thought might dismiss as superstition revealed itself as sophisticated ecology, as deep understanding of interconnection, as recognition that human flourishing depended on maintaining right relationship with all the other forms of existence that shared the world. The drum beat on, marking time, calling spirits, carrying shamans between worlds. The aurora danced its mysteries across winter sky. The snow fell and melted and fell again, writing and erasing, concealing and revealing, patient and persistent as time itself. While nomadic families moved across the frozen steppe, negotiating daily with cold and hunger and distance, other people, not so very far away in geographic terms, but infinitely distant in lived experience, inhabited a completely different world. These were the Russian settlers, traders, officials, and religious figures who had gradually pushed eastward across Siberia, establishing outposts, constructing forts, creating small islands of different culture in the vast indigenous territory. In a provincial outpost, a small collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a palisade, smoke rising from chimneys into the grey winter air, Life followed different rhythms, operated according to different assumptions about what was normal, what was necessary, what constituted comfort or hardship. The governor's residence, the largest building in the settlement, contained luxuries that would have seemed like fantasy to anyone living on the steppe. A proper stove, built from brick and tile, that radiated heat throughout multiple rooms, that transformed the interior into something almost warm, where people could remove their outer layers, where fingers didn't perpetually ache from cold. Glassware on tables, delicate and impractical, shipped at enormous expense from European Russia, serving no purpose beyond demonstrating that here, despite everything, civilized standards persisted. Books, precious books, their leather bindings cracked from cold and dry air, but their pages still intact, containing poetry and philosophy and histories of places thousands of miles away, connecting this remote outpost to the intellectual currents of distant capitals. The governor himself was a man who'd been sent here as punishment, or perhaps as opportunity. The distinction was often unclear in the Byzantine politics of imperial administration. He'd offended someone in St. Petersburg, or perhaps he'd simply been too competent and needed to be moved somewhere he couldn't threaten his superiors, or perhaps he'd requested this posting hoping that successful administration of frontier territory would lead to better positions later. He sat in his residence during the long winter evenings drinking tea, actual tea, imported at staggering cost, and reading reports about fur taxes, about indigenous populations who paid or didn't pay, about the slow expansion of Russian control over territories that had never belonged to anyone in the way his superiors understood ownership. He found the posting simultaneously boring and terrifying. Boring because so little happened, because weeks could pass with no meaningful events, because the intellectual stimulation he craved was utterly absent in this place where survival consumed most people's attention. Terrifying because the cold was something he'd never fully adjusted to, because he'd heard stories of people freezing to death mere yards from shelter, because the vastness outside the palisade walls felt hostile in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His wife, who'd accompanied him despite having every reason to refuse, managed the household with the same efficiency she'd brought to their life in European Russia. But he could see the strain on her. She aged faster here, not just from the harsh climate, but from the isolation, from the absence of society, from the reduction of her world to these few rooms, these few people, this endless negotiation with cold and distance. They had children, and the children were healthy enough, but they grew up strange, fluent in Russian, but also picking up native words from servants, comfortable with the cold in ways their parents never were, caught between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The governor sometimes wondered what would become of them, whether they'd eventually return to European Russia and find it alien, or whether they'd stay here and gradually become something neither Russian nor indigenous, but some new hybrid category. In the settlement, there was a small contingent of Cossacks, soldiers, farmers, hunters, who served as the military presence, who maintained order, who represented imperial authority in its most direct form. They were tough men, adapted to harsh conditions through generations of frontier life, more comfortable here than the governor would ever be, but they too depended on the indigenous population in ways they rarely acknowledged. The Cossacks needed guides when traveling to unfamiliar territories, needed hunters who could actually find game in winter, needed the practical knowledge that nomadic peoples had accumulated over centuries. They employed these people, or coerced them, or negotiated with them depending on circumstances and personalities, creating relationships that were complex mixtures of mutual dependence and mutual suspicion. The Cossack commander was a man named Prokhor, weathered and scarred, who'd spent 30 years on various Siberian frontiers and had learned to respect, if not like, the indigenous peoples he encountered. He understood that they knew things he didn't, that their survival skills far exceeded his own, that the contempt some of his men expressed for savages was both inaccurate and dangerous. He'd seen arrogant soldiers die from ignoring native advice, had seen entire expeditions fail because they refused to learn from people who actually understood the environment. He tried to teach his men better, tried to instill respect, if not equality, but he fought against deep cultural assumptions about civilization and primitiveness, about European superiority, about the natural order that placed Russians above indigenous peoples. Prokhor's wife was herself indigenous. He'd married her years ago during a different posting, and she'd adapted to settlement life while maintaining connections to her own people, serving as translator, mediator, cultural bridge. She inhabited a complicated position, not quite accepted by the Russian community, not quite part of the indigenous community anymore, existing in the liminal space between worlds. She bore this position with quiet dignity, raised their children to be fluent in multiple languages and multiple ways of seeing, and understood things about the dynamics of power and culture that her husband, despite his relative enlightenment, could never fully grasp. In the settlement there was also a small Orthodox monastery, just a handful of monks who'd taken it upon themselves to bring Christianity to the pagans, to save souls in this remote corner of the world. The monastery was a strange transplant, a piece of Byzantine religious culture dropped into Siberian landscape, persisting through sheer determination and faith. The monks maintained their prayer schedule, their fasting, their rituals, even when doing so seemed absurd given the conditions. They baked bread, actual bread, made from flour that cost enormously to transport, and the smell of it drifting from the monastery bakehouse was a powerful reminder of civilization, of Europe, of all the comforts and assumptions that settlement life tried desperately to maintain. The abbot was an elderly man who'd come here as a young priest decades ago, who'd intended to stay only a few years but had somehow never left, who'd become a fixture of the settlement, outlasting numerous governors and military commanders. He was learned, could read Greek and Latin, maintained a small library that was the only significant collection of books for hundreds of miles. He also learned indigenous languages, not to replace them with Russian, but to better understand the people he hoped to convert. And in the process of that learning, he'd come to respect their spiritual traditions, even as he believed them mistaken. His conversion efforts were gentle, patient, founded more on example than on coercion, and they had limited success. Some indigenous people accepted baptism, but often they incorporated Christianity into existing belief systems rather than replacing those systems, creating syncretic practices that the abbot found both encouraging and troubling. The monastery garden was an act of faith that bordered on defiance. The monks grew herbs and vegetables during the brief summer, carefully tended and protected, producing food that supplemented their diet and reminded them that life could create as well as endure. They kept bees miraculously, the hives wrapped in straw and sheltered during winter, the bees emerging in spring to work the brief flowering season. The honey they produced was precious beyond any monetary value. It was sweetness, it was abundance, it was proof that even here beauty and pleasure could exist. There were traders too, men who moved between settlements and indigenous camps, who trafficked in furs and metal goods and vodka, who existed in that morally ambiguous space where profit mattered more than loyalty to any particular community. These traders were often rough men, sometimes cruel, sometimes surprisingly fair, always calculating, always looking for advantage. They spoke indigenous languages fluently, often had native wives or mistresses, understood the protocols of gift-giving and relationship-building that made trade possible. Some accumulated significant wealth. Furs purchased cheaply in Siberia could be sold at enormous markup in Moscow or St. Petersburg, or even in Western European markets. Others barely survived, died in storms or from disease or from violence when deals went wrong, their ambitions exceeding their competence or their luck. The most successful trader in the region was a man named Grigory, who'd started with nothing, who'd learned multiple indigenous languages, who'd married strategically into a powerful native family, who'd built a network that stretched from the Arctic coast to the Mongolian border. He was wealthy by any standard, owned property in several settlements, employed dozens of people, lived in comfort that rivaled the governor's. But he was also distrusted by both communities. The Russians saw him as too native, too willing to accommodate indigenous customs, possibly too sympathetic to their interests. The indigenous peoples saw him as exploitative, as someone who'd used their knowledge and relationships for personal gain. Grigori himself seemed unbothered by either set of suspicions. He understood that wealth created its own category, that money and power transcended simple ethnic divisions, that he'd become something new, neither Russian nor indigenous, but something else, something that the emerging Siberian frontier was creating. The contrast between settlement life and nomadic life was stark, but it wasn't as simple as comfort versus hardship. Yes, the settlement had heated buildings, had stored food, had access to goods that nomadic people could only dream of. But the settlement was also precarious, utterly dependent on supply lines that could fail, on shipments that might not arrive, on complex social and economic structures that required constant maintenance. A hard winter could devastate the settlement just as easily as it could devastate a nomadic camp, perhaps more easily, because settlement people lacked the mobility and flexibility that nomadic culture provided. When supplies ran low, when trade routes closed, when disease struck, the settlement became a trap, a place where people were concentrated and vulnerable, where infection spread rapidly through crowded quarters, where food scarcity meant actual starvation rather than the managed hunger nomadic peoples were accustomed to. The settlement graveyard expanded steadily. Officials who succumbed to pneumonia, soldiers who froze on patrol, women who died in childbirth, children who didn't survive their first winter, traders who returned from expeditions sick with something that no one could cure. Death came to everyone regardless of privilege, regardless of heated buildings and imported tea, regardless of all the markers of civilization that the settlement worked so hard to maintain. Sometimes indigenous people came to the settlement to trade, to pay their fur taxes, to seek help during desperate times. The encounters were awkward, laden with misunderstanding on both sides. The Russians saw people who were dirty, who smelled of smoke and unwashed furs, who didn't speak Russian well, who seemed primitive in their technology and their social organization. The indigenous visitors saw people who were loud, who lived in bizarre permanent structures, who seemed unable to survive without enormous amounts of material support, who were spiritually dull, disconnected from the land and from the relationships that gave life meaning. Both groups were partially right and partially wrong in their assessments, seeing only surfaces, missing the sophistication of the other's adapted strategies for surviving in this impossible environment. The governor occasionally hosted indigenous leaders, awkward formal dinners where interpreters struggled to translate not just words, but entire frameworks of meaning, where gifts were exchanged according to protocols that no one fully understood, but everyone recognized as important. The indigenous leaders, sitting at tables using utensils they found clumsy and unnecessary, were performing their own version of diplomacy, assessing Russian power and intentions, gathering information that would help their people navigate the changing political landscape. They were not awed by Russian technology or culture. They were strategic, careful, calculating how much accommodation was necessary and how much independence could be preserved. Some Russians genuinely respected indigenous peoples, recognized their skills and knowledge, tried to build relationships based on something approaching equality. Others were simply contemptuous, saw them as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited, applied casual cruelty that they justified through racial theories and civilizational narratives. The indigenous peoples learned quickly to distinguish between these types, to know who could be trusted at least partially and who should be avoided whenever possible. The Orthodox monks made genuine efforts at connection, at understanding, at offering help, that wasn't purely transactional. The monastery became a place where indigenous people could sometimes find medical care, crude by any standard, but better than nothing, where they could shelter during extreme weather, where they could receive food during the worst famines. The monks extracted no immediate payment for these services, though they certainly hoped for conversions, hoped to build goodwill that would eventually lead to spiritual transformation. Some indigenous people accepted this arrangement cynically, taking help while having no intention of abandoning their traditional beliefs. Others were genuinely moved by the monks' charity, by their willingness to help without immediate reciprocation, and did embrace Christianity, though often in syncretic forms that retained elements of older spiritual practices. The monastery library contained ethnographic notes, observations about indigenous customs, language vocabularies, descriptions of religious practices, compiled by monks who were genuinely curious, who approached their missionary work with some degree of intellectual rigor. These notes would eventually prove valuable to historians and anthropologists, though the monks themselves weren't thinking about future scholarship. They were simply trying to understand the people they hoped to convert, trying to find points of contact between indigenous worldviews and Christian doctrine. Reading these notes, one sees both the limitations and the occasional insights. The monks could be remarkably perceptive about social structures and symbolic meanings, but they were also blinded by their theological assumptions, unable to accept that indigenous spiritual practices might be sophisticated and meaningful rather than simply erroneous. In the settlement, during the long winter nights, there were gatherings, parties where the small Russian community came together to drink, to dance, to temporarily forget the isolation and hardship. These gatherings had a desperate quality, a forced gaiety that tried to mask underlying anxiety. People drank too much, spoke too loudly, laughed too hard, trying to create the atmosphere of Moscow or St. Petersburg social life despite the complete absence of supporting infrastructure. The women dressed in whatever finery they'd managed to bring or maintain, dresses that were hopelessly impractical but symbolically crucial, markers of civilization, reminders that they were not savages, that culture and refinement persisted even here. The men drank vodka and told exaggerated stories about their adventures, about indigenous peoples they'd encountered, about the natural wonders they'd seen, each story trying to make sense of their presence in this place, trying to transform exile into adventure, boredom into exotic experience. The Cossacks had their own gatherings, rougher affairs where status was determined by different criteria: toughness, hunting skill, survival knowledge rather than administrative rank or family connections. These gatherings sometimes included indigenous people, especially those who'd married into Cossack families or who'd formed working relationships through guiding or hunting partnerships. The alcohol flowed freely at these events too, and vodka had become a complicated presence in indigenous communities, sometimes a trade good, sometimes a social lubricant, sometimes a destructive force that disrupted traditional patterns and created new forms of dependence and exploitation. The traders knew this and used it strategically, offering vodka as payment or gift, creating demand and then exploiting that demand, a pattern that would have long-term devastating effects on many indigenous communities. There were moments of genuine connection between the communities: a Cossack who learned to respect his indigenous hunting partner's knowledge, a Russian woman who befriended the indigenous woman who taught her how to prepare furs, a child who played with children from both communities and didn't yet understand all the divisions that adults maintained. These moments were real but also fragile, easily broken by larger political and economic forces, by the structural inequalities that shaped every interaction, by the historical momentum of imperial expansion that treated indigenous lands as empty space waiting to be claimed, indigenous peoples as populations to be controlled or converted, or sometimes simply removed. The settlements grew slowly, incrementally, establishing more permanent presence in territories that had been purely indigenous for thousands of years. Roads were cut, if you could call them roads, barely passable tracks that connected one settlement to another, that represented enormous labor and represented also the gradual transformation of the landscape from indigenous space to colonial space. The fur trade intensified, driven by European demand for luxury goods, creating economic pressure that reached deep into indigenous communities, changing subsistence patterns, creating new forms of inequality, gradually eroding traditional lifeways. Some indigenous families became wealthy by the standards of their communities, accumulating metal tools, weapons, cloth, becoming middlemen in trade networks, gaining power and influence that altered traditional social structures. Others became impoverished, depleted their local resources trying to meet tax demands, found themselves caught in debt relationships with traders, began the long, slow descent into dependence and marginalization. The changes happened slowly enough that each generation could pretend things were still mostly the same, that traditional life persisted, but looking across decades, the transformation was profound and mostly irreversible. The governor, in his warmer moments, sometimes felt guilt about this process. He could see what was happening, could see the costs that indigenous peoples were paying for Russian expansion, could see that the civilizing mission his superiors spoke about so confidently was actually a process of dispossession and cultural destruction. But he was also a product of his time and culture, believed ultimately in Russian superiority, believed that indigenous peoples would benefit from incorporation into the empire, even if the process was painful, believed that history moved in a particular direction and that his role was to manage that movement as humanely as possible rather than to question it. He wrote reports that were simultaneously honest about indigenous suffering and confident about the eventual beneficial outcomes of colonization, containing contradictions he never fully acknowledged or resolved. His wife was less conflicted. She simply wanted to survive here, wanted her children to grow up healthy, wanted eventually to return to European Russia, where life made sense according to the rules she'd learned in childhood. She had no particular animosity toward indigenous peoples, but also no particular interest in them. They were simply part of the landscape, part of the exotic strangeness that defined this place, part of what had to be endured until escape became possible. The monastery offered a different vision, not political control or economic extraction, but spiritual transformation, the replacement of indigenous religions with Orthodox Christianity, the creation of a universal church that transcended ethnic divisions. The monks believed this sincerely, believed they were offering salvation, believed that indigenous peoples would benefit from accepting Christianity, even if it meant abandoning their traditional practices. Some indigenous people agreed, found in Christianity answers to spiritual questions, found in the church a community that welcomed them, found in conversion a path to literacy and education that traditional life didn't provide. Others resisted, saw Christianity as another form of colonization, as an attack on their identity and their relationship with ancestors and land, as something to be opposed or avoided even when political and economic power made resistance dangerous. The spiritual battle, if you could call it that, was complex, never fully won by either side, producing instead a landscape of hybrid practices, of people who called themselves Christian but maintained traditional shrines, who attended church but also sought shamanic healing, who found ways to be multiple things simultaneously rather than making the complete conversion the monks hoped for. Winter in the settlement was its own kind of ordeal, not the mobile negotiation with cold that nomadic life required, but a static siege, waiting out the months when travel became nearly impossible, when supply lines closed, when the small community turned inward, and everyone got thoroughly tired of everyone else. The settlement was crowded in winter, people pressed together in heated spaces, privacy impossible, tensions rising as the months dragged on. There were fights, feuds, affairs that everyone knew about because secrecy was impossible, social dramas that would have been trivial in a larger context, but here became all-consuming because there was simply nothing else to focus on. Spring brought relief, the breaking of ice, the return of some mobility, the arrival of supply caravans, the reopening of trade routes, the general sense that the world was starting again, that isolation was ending. People emerged from their winter quarters pale and irritable, desperate for space and movement and anything new. The contrast with nomadic life was striking here. For nomadic peoples, spring meant increased work, increased movement, the exhausting labor of following herds and gathering resources. For settlement people, spring meant relief, relaxation, the easing of confinement. Each group would have found the other's experience incomprehensible. The nomads couldn't imagine voluntarily staying in one place through winter. The settlers couldn't imagine deliberately choosing to live in constant motion without shelter or stability. Both were right and wrong. Each had adapted to conditions in ways that made sense within their own framework, but seemed absurd or impossible from the outside. The settlement's existence was itself a kind of miracle. The logistics of keeping dozens of people alive in this environment, fed and clothed and housed, was enormously complex, required supply chains that stretched thousands of miles, required the labor of hundreds of people the settlers never saw, required the exploitation of indigenous resources and labor that made the whole system possible. The settlers rarely thought about this complexity. They simply lived within it, complained when supplies ran low, celebrated when new goods arrived, took for granted the infrastructure that supported them. But that infrastructure was fragile, could fail catastrophically, could leave the settlement stranded and dying just as easily as nomadic families could be caught by disaster. The difference was that settlers had lost the skills to survive without that infrastructure. They couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't travel safely, couldn't read the environment the way indigenous peoples could, had become dependent on a system that made them simultaneously more comfortable and more vulnerable. There was a kind of tragic irony in watching relatively wealthy, privileged people with heated buildings and imported goods and access to written knowledge, die from simple cold or starvation because they couldn't or wouldn't learn the survival skills that indigenous peoples mastered as children. The stories were known but rarely discussed. The expedition that got lost 20 miles from the settlement and froze to death because they didn't know how to build emergency shelter. The merchant who tried to travel alone and disappeared, his body found months later. The governor's predecessor who fell through ice because he didn't recognize the signs that locals would have seen immediately. Each death was preventable if only the person had listened, had learned, had respected the knowledge that indigenous peoples offered. But pride and prejudice made learning difficult. Accepting indigenous knowledge meant accepting indigenous authority on some level, meant acknowledging that European civilization didn't have all the answers, meant becoming a student to teachers who were supposed to be inferior. Some individuals managed this psychological shift, learned genuinely, became competent in ways that bridged both worlds. But they were exceptions, and their competence often made them suspect to both communities. Too native for the Russians, too Russian for the indigenous peoples, caught in the uncomfortable middle space that all cultural intermediaries inhabit. The settlement represented power, military power, political power, economic power, but it also represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment, an attempt to impose European patterns on a landscape that didn't support them, that required completely different strategies for successful habitation. The nomadic peoples understood this intuitively. You don't impose structure on this environment, you move with it, adapt to it, accept its terms. The settlers understood it intellectually but couldn't or wouldn't act on that understanding because their entire identity was bound up in imposing structure, in creating European order, in Asian chaos. The wealth the settlement represented, the heated buildings, the imported goods, the food security, was real but also illusory, dependent on systems that could fail, that required constant maintenance and constant extraction from the surrounding territory. When those systems worked, settlement life was incomparably more comfortable than nomadic life. When they failed, settlement people died faster and more helplessly than nomadic peoples because they'd lost or never acquired the skills that made survival possible without infrastructure support. This was the fundamental paradox. Civilization brought comfort and vulnerability simultaneously, made life better and more fragile, created new possibilities and new dependencies that couldn't be easily escaped. The nomadic peoples, watching all this from outside, drew their own conclusions. Some saw opportunity, ways to engage with the new economy, to gain access to metal tools and other goods that made life easier, to find new paths to prestige and influence. Others saw threat, the gradual encroachment of foreign power, the erosion of traditional practices, the transformation of their world into something they didn't recognize and couldn't control. Both were correct. The arrival of Russian settlements was simultaneously opportunity and catastrophe, bringing benefits and costs that would take generations to fully play out. The story of this encounter between nomadic indigenous cultures and expanding Russian Empire was one of profound inequality, of cultural transformation that was rarely voluntary, of the slow grinding down of one way of life to make room for another. But it was also more complex than simple stories of colonization usually allow. There were moments of genuine respect, of mutual learning, of relationships that transcended the larger political dynamics. There were indigenous people who found ways to thrive in the new reality, who became traders or guides or cultural mediators, who maintained their identity while also engaging strategically with the colonial system. There were Russians who genuinely loved this place, who learned indigenous languages and customs, who became more Siberian than European in their adaptations and loyalties. The warmth of the settlement, the literal warmth of heated buildings and the metaphorical warmth of imported European culture, was something nomadic peoples would never fully access, not because they were excluded necessarily, but because accessing it required transformations they weren't willing or able to make. To live in settlements meant abandoning migration, abandoning the herd, abandoning the entire structure of life that had sustained their people for thousands of years. Some made that choice for various reasons: economic necessity, desire for new opportunities, exhaustion with the hardships of nomadic life, strategic calculation about where power was moving. Others refused, maintained their traditional patterns, even as the world around them transformed, even as it became harder and harder to do so. And perhaps both choices were valid, both were responses to impossible situations where there were no good options, only different combinations of loss and preservation, only different ways of surviving in a world that was changing too fast, in directions too unpredictable to fully navigate. We've traveled far tonight, across frozen steppe and through quiet lives, through the daily struggles that most history books never record, through the spaces between great events where actual living happened. We've walked alongside a Chika through winters that tested everything, through the slow accumulation of experience that transforms a child into an elder, through the ordinary heroism of simply continuing when everything is hard. We've glimpsed the spirit world that layered over the physical landscape, the mysteries that ancient peoples carried without demanding they be solved, the acceptance of not knowing that might itself be a kind of wisdom we've lost in our rush toward certainty and explanation. We've seen the contrast between nomadic movement and settlement stability, between the wealth that makes you vulnerable and the poverty that keeps you adaptable, between the different strategies human beings developed for surviving in places that seem designed to forbid survival. And through it all, we've witnessed something profound: the quiet persistence of human life in its endless varieties, the refusal to yield even when every sensible calculation suggests yielding, the creation of meaning and beauty and purpose even in circumstances that offer nothing but hardship. The Siberian nomads weren't heroes in any epic sense. They were simply people doing what needed to be done, day after day, generation after generation, carrying forward the accumulated knowledge that made continuation possible. They didn't conquer nature or transcend their environment. They lived within its constraints, accepted its terms, found ways to make life bearable, and occasionally even good within those harsh parameters. Their legacy isn't monuments or written records or any of the usual markers by which history measures significance. But it's no less real for being invisible. It's in the descendant communities that still exist, that still carry pieces of that ancient knowledge, that still remember how to read landscapes and weather, and the subtle signs that separate survival from disaster. It's in the languages that persist despite enormous pressure toward assimilation, in the stories that get retold around fires and in living rooms, in the skills that get passed from grandparents to grandchildren who might never use them but who carry them anyway as connections to deeper time, to ancestors who survived impossible things. You're lying somewhere warm tonight, probably, in a bed with blankets, in a room with heating, in a structure that doesn't move, that offers stability and protection that nomadic peoples could never have imagined. The water you drink comes from taps, the food you eat comes from stores, the knowledge you need is available at your fingertips through devices that would seem like magic or witchcraft to people whose entire library of knowledge existed in memory and in practice. The gulf between your life and theirs is almost inconceivable. You've never been truly cold, never been truly hungry, never had to navigate purely by memory and feel, never had to make decisions where wrong choices mean death for yourself and everyone who depends on you. And yet, for all that distance, something connects. We're still the same species, still carrying the same basic architecture of consciousness and emotion that they carried. We still feel cold even if our cold is trivial compared to theirs, still experience fear even if our dangers are different, still love our children with the same fierce protectiveness, still seek meaning and purpose and connection beyond mere survival. The lives we've explored tonight, lives of hardship and endurance and quiet beauty, remind us that comfort is recent, is fragile, is not guaranteed, is sustained by systems that could fail faster than we imagine. They remind us that human beings are capable of surviving almost anything if they must, that we contain depths of toughness and adaptability that modern life rarely requires us to access. They remind us, too, of what we've lost, not just skills, though we've lost those, but certain kinds of awareness, certain qualities of attention and relationship with the natural world that simply aren't possible when you're insulated by technology and infrastructure from direct experience of environment. Perhaps there's value in sometimes sitting with that loss, in acknowledging what was traded away in the bargain that brought us heated homes and abundant food and medical care and all the other comforts we take for granted. Not because we should romanticize hardship. Life on the frozen steppe was brutal, shortened, often ended in ways that were painful and unjust, but because remembering helps us understand who we are, where we came from, what we're capable of, what we're connected to. The snow still falls in Siberia, the wind still howls across empty steppe, the reindeer still migrate in their ancient patterns, though their numbers are fewer now and their routes are more constrained. A few families still live as nomads, though most have settled, have adapted to new ways, have found different strategies for continuing in a world that no longer supports the old patterns. The stories persist, though, the memories carry forward, and somewhere in that persistence is a kind of immortality. A Chika and all the other ordinary people who lived and struggled and died without fanfare become part of the larger story of human endurance, human adaptation, human refusal to disappear. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll remember the quiet strength of people who survived things you can't imagine, who found beauty in landscapes you'd find only hostile, who created meaning and purpose in circumstances that offered neither. Perhaps you'll feel just for a moment the weight of all that history behind you, all those generations of humans who persisted, who continued, who passed forward the gift of life despite every hardship. perhaps you'll understand a little better what it means to be human, not in the abstract, not in the triumphant sense of civilization and progress, but in the humble sense of being a creature that survives, that adapts, that keeps going, that finds ways forward, even when none seem available. The cold outside your window, if you feel it at all, is nothing compared to what they endured. The darkness of night is temporary, broken by electric lights, temporary because morning will come with certainty and with it warmth and safety and all the structures that support your comfortable life. But somewhere in that small cold you might feel, somewhere in that small darkness, there's a tiny echo of what they lived, what they knew, what they survived. Let that echo remind you. You come from survivors. You carry their resilience in your bones. You are the heir to thousands of generations who faced impossible things and continued anyway. And if you ever face your own impossible things, different impossible things, modern impossible things, you carry within you the same capacity for endurance, the same ability to adapt, the same fundamental human persistence that kept families alive through Siberian winters. Rest now in your warmth and your comfort and your safety. Rest knowing that those who came before you earned this ease through their struggles, that your soft bed tonight is built on the backs of countless ancestors who slept on frozen ground. Rest with gratitude for what you have, with respect for what they endured, with awareness of the long thread of human continuation that connects you to them and them to you. The winter is long, but spring always comes eventually. The cold is deep, but warmth persists somewhere, waiting. The darkness is heavy, but dawn breaks even in the deepest north, even after the longest night. These were the truths that sustained them, that kept them moving through endless white, that gave them reasons to continue. And they're true still, for you, tonight, as you drift into the gentle dark of sleep, carrying with you the quiet stories of people who lived fully in impossible places, who found meaning in hardship, who survived. Sleep well in your warm bed, in your heated room, in your safe space. Sleep with the knowledge that you're connected to something larger, something deeper, something that persists across time and change and all the transformations history brings. The steppe is quiet now. The snow falls softly. The reindeer move through their ancient patterns. And somewhere in that vast white silence, memory persists. Stories continue, and the long winter night gives way, eventually, inevitably, to morning.